Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast here on August the 15th. So let's get a heat unit accumulation update. We'll discuss the yield effects of our droughty weather, and then we're going to focus on sudden death syndrome because it's really showing up in soybean fields fast this week. So, as far as our current heat unit accumulation, basing it on a planting date of May the 1st in the East Lansing area, we've now accumulated 1,851 heat units. So, in comparison, we're up 17 heat units from last year and now 67 heat units versus the 5-year average. Going south, the Coldwater, we're 6 heat units ahead of last year and 49 ahead of the 5-year average. Now, finally, going north to Mount Pleasant, there we're still 3 heat units behind last year, but we're 74 heat units ahead of the 5-year average. So, as a whole, we continue to be nicely ahead of the average heat unit accumulation this year. Now, as for my travels this past week, I was actually able to spend 2 days working our booth and talking to farmers across the area at the Michigan Agro Expo. Now, the key topics for the week were how droughty much of the area had been over the last few weeks, during pollination in corn and pod development in soybeans. Of course, during the same time, much of the state got anywhere from a half inch to over 4 inches of rain this last Tuesday night. So, folks were happy with the moisture, but still expressed some concerns about whether or not it was maybe too little or too late to maintain full yield potential for the year. Now, in many cases, I'd agree. I am seeing some tip back in corn where, either pollination didn't fully fill the tips of the cobs or kernel abortion occurred on those kernels that did pollinate, but then maybe ran out of moisture to keep them developing. Now, in these cases, it was not an issue of tassel wrap, but more of an issue of kernel loss due to drought stress. Now, as for soybeans, we know that heat and drought this time of the year can cause both a loss of flowers and pods. So, when we think of what makes up soybean yield, we always think of trying to increase both the number of seeds and then the size of each individual seed. Now, when we lose flowers and subsequent pods, we are negatively affecting that first half of the yield equation. Now, we still have lots of time for developing more flowers and pods, and definitely have some time to put some size on the beans that we were able to hold on to. But we've probably taken some of the top end yield potential out of this year's crop. Now, the other big topic this week was the development of sudden death syndrome, or SDS for short. Now, from farmers' fields across the area to walking even the plots at the Agro Expo grounds, it's developing quickly and, boy, kind of early enough to have some negative effect on yields this year. Now, of course, the first step in managing SDS is to correctly identify the problem. So, what you should be asking yourself is, what are the visual symptoms of SDS in soybeans? Now, with sudden death syndrome, the first thing we look for is leaves that show these dark green veins and then kind of yellow to dead brown necrotic tissue in the space between those veins on the leaves in those affected plants. Now, the earlier we see these symptoms, the greater the potential of yield loss is from SDS. And in reality, the infection actually occurs weeks earlier in the spring when fusarium enters into the roots of the plant. And oftentimes, that enters through the holes left in the roots from soybean cyst nematode feeding. Now, this allows the fusarium to enter the plant, and by this time of the year, the infection is now showing up in the leaf tissue. So, unfortunately, at this time of the year, there's no rescue treatment for SDS. But, there are some things we need to consider for the next time we go to these fields with soybeans. For SDS prone fields, let's kind of consider the following two things before planting them back into soybeans. First off, we're going to want to plant a variety with a good genetic tolerance to SDS. Now, if you look in the seed catalog, you'll find that most seed companies are going to have some pretty good ratings for all their varieties for sudden death tolerance. And second, we really need to be using a seed treatment such as Saltro, which is specifically designed to manage SDS. With a good seed treatment specifically developed for the management of SDS, the goal is to kill the fusarium around the seed, in order to delay the onset of SDS late enough into the growing season that its effect on yield is minimized. Now, I've personally seen SDS take like 50% or more yield from a field when that infection comes in early. So it's well worth managing for this disease in the future. Now, be sure to note that the leaf symptoms of, that green vein and necrosis between the veins, it's also a foliar symptom for brown stem rot. So before just assuming you have SDS, you will need to dig up the affected plants and you got to check those stems and those roots. Now, as for the roots, you'll often see a bluish fungal growth on the roots of SDS infected plants, but you won't always see that. Now, when you will need, though, to take your knife and kind of split open that stem, and you're looking for the vein that runs inside the center of that soybean stem, kind of near the soil line. Now, if that vein is white and clean, but maybe the woody tissue on either side of the vein is slightly grayish, then you probably have SDS. But if the center vein is brown, then you most likely have BSR or brown stem rot. Now, if you do have BSR, the only real remedy is variety selection for future plantings in those affected fields. So, as we wrap up this week's Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast, let's continue to get out there and walk our fields. We need to be continuing to scout for southern rust and tar spot that we talked about in our special edition a couple days ago. We also need to check out where, we see discolored leaves in the canopy. If you find either that SDS or brown stem rot, we're going to start working on a plan for next year to manage soybeans in that field and just do our best to get the best yields possible in those situations. Also, please note that actually there will be no podcast next week, Friday, as my wife and I will be celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary out of the area. So this is Charles Scoble, your Golden Harvest agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great week.